are going to start in Job today. So I don't know. When's the last time y'all studied the book of Job? Has it been like recently? Because if that was like the last book y'all studied before I came, I'd like to know that. But I don't think it was. Anybody want to say? What y'all studied before I got here? Do y'all even remember? We've been in Corinthians for 2 years. Oh, okay. Well, 1 year. Okay. So it may have felt like two. I'm hoping that Job doesn't take that long, but we'll see. It is a big book though, and there's a lot here. It's really a magnificent book. I'm going to get into the introduction and talk about chapter 1. I love this book. Well, it's part of the Bible, so obviously you're going to love it. But there are also, hold on a second. Sorry, I'm trying to get things organized. It's one of those things. It's one of those books that has so much meaning, and we tend to kind of skip over it. And what I mean by that is when I've had it in classes before, what I would see is we would kind of rush through the passages to basically get to the end to talk about the last 4 chapters with God meets Job in the whirlwind. I don't want to get in here and park, but I also want to kind of analyze it, look at it from a perspective of growth and even decline. Look at Job compared to his friends to see why God said the things that he did about him and where we can go from there. We can learn a lot of lessons about ourselves, about God, about his plan. And we'll also run across a lot of things that we might discuss that we have no way of answering, but there's plenty of information about it, just not enough information. So we will dabble into some of that because that's part of what this book is about. But the more I study it, the more amazed I am at what's in here. And there are some really good books out on it. Wayne Jackson has a pretty good book. It's really it's a kind of a synopsis. It's a pretty small book, but he does a really good job explaining a lot of things. I don't agree with him everything, and who am I to disagree? But everybody has their own ideas about some of these things, and you may find some things in here you disagree with me about. That's okay. We can talk about them. And the good part is most of the stuff in here we're going to see eye to eye, because the themes that are in here are incredible, but they're also basic to humanity. So this can really get into some deep waters. And I don't want to be shallow and I don't want to go too deep, but we will try to find a balance in there somewhere. So how about we start with a prayer and then we'll get started. Our Father, thank you so much for all that you've done for us. Thank you that we have the ability to come to you. We thank you that you've given us so many great things in your word, that your word has been delivered to us and we can trust it, we can understand it, and that we can put it into practice in our lives. And as we go through this book tonight and on through however long it takes us, and as long as we continue to study your word, Father, help us to find ways to put it into practice so that you can be glorified and so that we can grow closer to you. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Okay. We have I'm going to give you kind of a quick intro to Job. I was reading in Wayne Jackson's book, the one I mentioned. I mentioned books. Wayne Jackson has a really good book. There is one of the commentaries that I'll mention. I don't have it right now. I'll mention it in the class. There are some commentaries out there that have outstanding work. I don't trust the whole overall commentary maybe, but there's some different works that I've seen that have really taken some out of some really good passages and ideas from them. And Wayne Jackson's book quoted Victor Hugo, and Victor Hugo reportedly said, "Tomorrow, if all literature was to be destroyed and it was left to me to choose to have only one, I should save Job." He had a really high fondness for the book. Oh, there it is. Okay. Daniel Webster said, the book of Job, taken as a mere work of literary genius, is one of the most wonderful productions of any age and of any language. That's some pretty high praise. But Daniel Webster was a very studied man. And there definitely is a lot here. And it deserves a good study. Historian Philip Schaff said, the book of Job rises like a pyramid in the history of literature, without a predecessor and without a rival. And so there's some high praise out there for this book. And as we go through, you'll see it's a beautiful book. It's well written. Generally speaking, what we get out of it is it's a lot of doom and gloom. There is a lot of that in here too, but we see Job's growth as a human and coming to realizations. We see a lot of history. We see a lot of mindsets that have been really shaping the world for millennia. And we'll talk a lot about that. We'll even see evidence of some things that are resulting from the flood that make its way into the book about mindsets and attitudes, that kind of thing, as we get into it. We do know that it's inspired by God. It's dealing with topics that, like I said, are fundamental to the human experience. And it addresses those topics in a way that addresses some of the common misconceptions about evil, about pain, about suffering, even about Satan, and about God's nature. It does not provide us with answers to some of these really fundamental questions. And that can be frustrating to us. We have to learn that we may not get answers, but we can still enjoy the process of going through it. And we can understand tidbits, we can understand pieces. And it really is satisfying when you finally can understand some things about God's nature and these really fundamental questions. But it minimizes the importance of understanding it all. And it does it in a very brilliant way, and it helps us to visualize something bigger. And that's always a good thing for us. And it was written thousands of years ago. We're not exactly sure when, but there's never developed a better address to these issues than this book's message. There's nothing in the Bible that relates to it in that sense. Nothing in the Bible addresses some of these fundamental underlying things as well as Job does, or as much as Job does. Okay, so that's kind of a brief introduction. The writer of the book, there are a lot of different ideas about who wrote the book. I personally believe it was Job. I think that's pretty common, but you may be surprised that most historians or most commentaries that I've read actually say that they believe Moses wrote it. And that's based on ancient Jewish tradition. Ancient Jewish tradition said that Moses wrote it. Curtis Cates from the Memphis School of Preaching, he believes that Solomon wrote it. The validity there, or the reason that sounds very appealing, is because it's listed with the other great wisdom literature, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Now, David wrote Psalms, or most of the Psalms, but Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon have the same kind of feel, deals with some of the same kind of material in a different way, but he still does. But I think it was Job, and I don't think that it's uncommon for people to think that. But ultimately, we know that the Holy Spirit is who wrote this. Paul quotes from the book of Job in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 19. He's actually quoting from Job chapter 5, verse 13. And that shows that Paul recognized it as scripture. He's quoting it as authority. He also quotes in Romans chapter 11, verse 35. He's actually referring to two different passages in Job when he writes that. And that was from Wayne Jackson. That's a very good point. He wouldn't be using it if it's not valid or if it's not truth. We probably know also that this book, that it took place actually before Moses. And I think it actually even could have taken place even before Abraham. It could have been one of the first books that was ever written in the Bible. Now, Genesis obviously predates it as far as material, but as far as when it was written, it's very likely that this was actually the first book that was ever written for the Bible. Here's some reasons for this, and this comes from Curtis Cates, and he had some really good points. The father in this place, Job, acted as a priest, and that was something that was unique for the time before the law of Moses. Now, after the law of Moses came, the Gentiles still had their fathers do that, granted, but this is one of the pieces of evidence. There's no mention of the law of Moses. It could be because he's a Gentile, but we don't even actually know that. The matter of Job's wealth, it was measured in cattle and slaves. That's how they defined him as being rich. The length of Job's life is another one. He was older than his friends, and he lived, after this was over, he lived another 140 years. So we don't actually know how old he was when all this started, but we do know he lived another 140 years after this. So the length of time shows it was quite a ways back, maybe even closer to the flood. Let's see, the monetary unit is described in the book. It's only mentioned in Genesis chapter 33. That's the only other place it's mentioned. So it's ancient. The book is also, it's written in early Hebrew language. It wasn't the same language that would have been later on. That, for example, some people believe that the book was written during the time of like Daniel, but it wasn't written that language. It was prior to that. Also in this book, daughters inherited along with brothers, and that would have actually violated Mosaic law, so it probably wasn't during that time. It also mentioned dinosaurs, and we'll talk about that too. That's an interesting one to get into. But that's really neither here nor there. It is interesting. The interesting thing for me, in my perspective, is how old it is and how close to the flood that it actually was, and that's going to come up later in the book. Job was an actual person. He was mentioned in Ezekiel 14. He was mentioned in James chapter 5 and verse 11. He was a resident of Uz. That place is mentioned in Jeremiah and Lamentation. Uz is probably in the Syrian desert, east of Palestine, excuse me. And Job, it depends on the interpretation of his name, but you can interpret the name Job to mean hated, or the hated one, which is pretty ironic. Actually, not ironic, fitting, right? That's how he viewed himself in this book. And the nature of the book, it's wisdom literature. That is, it's grouped in there with Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. It's poetic in nature. It's after the initial start, the rest of it is poetry. So we have to keep that in mind when we're interpreting it. We have to leave room for poetic license, that kind of thing. It's important to recognize that. And I don't know if you know this, but Hebrew poetry was very different than English poetry. English poetry has to rhyme. Well, poetry for the most part, poetry in the Old Testament in Hebrew language, they rhymed ideas. They didn't rhyme words. And so they would have layers of words, sentences, one on top of the other. And these were all parallel, or they had relationship to one another. And that was how they did it. There were basically 4 different ways that they did this. I don't want to go into too much detail, but we have synonymous parallelism, which means they have 2 phrases, and both the phrases are basically saying the same thing. You have antithetical, which is you have 2 phrases and they're saying the opposite things. And both of those are very good as far as being able to help us interpret a passage. We have synthetic or progressive. That is the second and third and fourth lines all build on each other until you get to a main point. And then comparative, which is ideas are being compared in there. So those are basic types of Hebrew poetry. So we have to keep that in mind as we go through. And that's one of the reasons why we may actually see things differently from time to time in the book, because there has to be some amount of interpretation more so than regular straightforward literature. Here's some themes. This is from Pat McIntosh. Job. Actually, this relates to all the wisdom literature. The book of Job teaches us how to suffer. The book of Psalms teaches us how to pray. The book of Proverbs teaches us how to act. The book of Ecclesiastes teaches us how to enjoy life. And the Song of Solomon teaches us how to love. So that's an interesting way of looking at that. So anyway, that's basically it. There's a general outline of the text. I'm not going to go through, but I may post it in the Facebook group just so you'll have it. So let's go ahead and jump into the text. Since we got that introduction out of the way, we're going to look at the first chapter here, and then hopefully we'll get into the whole chapter. So verse 1 says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the east. And his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So it was, when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did regularly. So there's a lot of things going on here. And notice verse 1. The book will emphasize this, and Job will actually emphasize this as well. It says at the end of that verse, he was blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. That's a very important part of this book, as we all know. And it relates to a lot of the struggle that he felt from his disease, things he was going through. Now, blameless and upright does not mean perfect, but it means blameless. Blameless means that nobody can actually lay a charge against you. That's impeccable character is what that is. We can see this examples of this in chapter 23, and we'll see it in chapter 31 as well, where in 23, chapter 31, Job is giving a huge defense of himself. And he talks about how he lived his life. And it's really incredible, the things that he says about himself. It's really amazing to see how he lived. So he's a very good example for us. We also see that he had great possessions. He was called the greatest of the people of the East. Now, a lot of historians or a lot of people that write commentaries suggest that East probably means east of the Jordan River. So this could indicate Jewish authorship. It could indicate that Job was of that lineage, or it just could be that Jewish people wrote the first part of this. We don't really know if Job actually was of the Jewish people or not. It never says. But that is an interesting observation that people made. So in verse 4, we have the introduction to his sons and the feast that they would have in their house. It says on their appointed day, each on his appointed day, or each on his day. Some translations don't have the word appointed. And it's been suggested that this is probably, it could be related to their birthday. I don't know how far back birthday celebrations go. I know the ancient pharaohs did it, but I don't know if that applies here in this case or not. But a lot of people have mentioned that in a lot of the places I've looked and read. And they mentioned that they took turns hosting each other in their homes. Some people have even said they did this every day of the week. There's 7 days, and there's 7 brothers, and so they just took turns every night. And this is how they lived. Whatever it means, we don't actually know. Whatever it means, they had set days where they got together. They were a close-knit family. You can see that. They brought their sisters in. They'd spend time together. They had a close family bond, right? That's interesting. It also shows that Job evidently didn't have more than one wife. He was a family man. He taught his children to be the same way. So that says something about him. It also could speak to the timing of this. It could be that after that polygamy was not as popular at this time. It's possible. Later on, as the world digressed and polygamy started becoming more and more common, see, that was something that was a perversion that gradually got worse and worse. So from the time of the flood on after that. And the if you think of it that way, then that shows if a rich man had only one wife, it could lend itself to the idea that we're talking early on, because most powerful men would have had later on, they would have had several wives. That's at least a possibility. So we have here then all these adults, they're living on their own, except for the daughters who lived with Job. And that was, of course, according to the culture. And they would live with Job. They would live with their father until they were married. That's how it worked. But the 7 sons, they lived off on their own. And Job he cared about them. So it says that when the days of feasting had run their course, they had done after their partying, then Job would actually send and sanctify them. He would rise early in the morning. He would offer burnt offerings for them. So he considered himself their priest. They considered him evidently their priest. At least he took it upon himself to be responsible for his children. That also shows that he was someone who thought of other people, right? He had a responsibility for other people. He felt responsible for them. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage for what's about to happen. It says in verse 6, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil." So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hand, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Okay, so this is an interesting thing. In verse 6, it says there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Okay, we really don't know what this means. If you look in the Old Testament, I was reading a book. I think it was either Curtis Cates or it was Wayne Jackson. They said every time the Bible uses that phrase "sons of God," it's always referring to angelic beings. And that's really debatable. For one thing, that phrase is only used about 3 times. So you can't really say that every case, because this is one of those cases. That means a third of the time we're not actually sure what it means. Sons of God is actually used to refer to, in Genesis chapter 6, it's referred to Seth and the descendants of Seth. In that passage. So if you look over there in Genesis chapter 6, this is when it talks about right before the flood and the problems of the world. Let's see here. It says in verse 4, there were giants on the earth in those days and also after, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So there's actually people that believe that the sons of God mentioned here are actually angels that came and actually had intercourse with women of the world, and from them produced giants. The Bible does not teach that. I don't believe it's even possible. We can make a strong argument, really, that that's not even possible. They're not flesh and blood, first of all. But also, when you look at the context here, it says in verse 1, it came to pass when men began to multiply on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves and all whom they chose. All right, so this is part of the problem. the sons of God were mixing in with the daughters of the world. If you map that out and you look at all the way back to chapter 4 and verse 25, it says, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth, for God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. So at the end of chapter 4, we have men starting to call on the name of the Lord. Chapter 5 is really just a chapter talking about genealogies. And then immediately after that, it's like a parenthetical statement. Immediately after that, it says, at this time, now it came to pass that when the men were multiplying on the earth, that the children of God, the sons of God, these are the followers. It makes sense to say these are the children of Seth. Those who were calling on God began to intermix and intermingle with the women of this world. And so we have a strong case saying that this is actually talking about humans. There's another passage in this book. Let's see, Job chapter 38 in verse 7 speaks of the sons of men, sons of God. And that literally, if you look at the language, it's actually talking about stars. The stars sing, the sons of God sing for the creation of the world. The stars are actually singing, and they do emit noise. So that's how the phrase is used. It can mean a lot of different things. What I'm saying is, in this text, in this context, it's talking about, it could be talking about two things, angels or humans. And if you look at it, then I believe that it's talking about human beings. This is a time when humans on the earth, when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. So there's some people that have a big debate about why was Satan allowed to be in heaven. Well, he may not have actually been there at all to begin with. This may be a time when the people of God came together to present themselves to God. It could be a situation where they're there for worship or something like this, and this is where Satan showed up. They presented themselves. We have no idea why they presented themselves. People have really, I'm talking about this because people have really made a really big deal about this. They really kind of read into the text. They've created some ideas that actually are not there. Some people, for example, I read it says that the sons of God came in to present themselves before the Lord, that this was a time when God had called all the angels together, and he's going to have a big meeting for some reason. And he's going to have a big meeting with all the angels for some reason. And when he did this, Satan snuck in, and he's kind of slipped into the gates as if God wouldn't know he was there. It never says that. So we have to go by what it says, and really anything else is not necessarily, can't say it's wrong, but you can't say it's right either, right? Because we don't know. But so the Lord did address Satan, and it says he came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." It says, "I've been walking around all of the earth." Satan, the word Satan means adversary in the Old Testament. That's what it means. And it describes someone who lies in wait for someone in order to attack them. That was what he was doing. Remember how Peter said that he was like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour? That's exactly what he's describing himself here. In fact, it could be what Peter was referring to. But he was wandering around to and fro on the earth. What's he looking for? Probably looking for whoever he can devour, whatever he can do, whatever harm he can cause. Okay. And so, let's see here. I don't want to get into the whole eternal evil kind of discussion. If you look at the statement that God makes in verse 8, the Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? That sentence that also has been really hotly debated. It For some people, it doesn't make sense. How can God put the focus on Job and say, "Hey, why don't you attack Job? I dare you." It's almost like he's throwing the gauntlet down, and that's usually how it's been described, where God says, "You know what? You've been looking all over the earth trying to find someone to devour, but you hadn't. Have you actually tested Job? I mean, I think you ought to try him, because it's almost like daring him." Which doesn't fit the nature of God. I don't think God intends, he will allow us to be tempted, and he will put us into places of temptation, but that doesn't mean that he's going to be calling Satan's attention to it. It is possible, but I don't see that as something that has to be seen this way. In fact, if you look in the language a little bit, I'm not an expert by any means, so this is just my opinion, but you can look at it in a different light. You can actually see this as a question, not, "Hey, would you go test him?" You might could actually look at it as a question. I know what you're saying. I know what you've been doing. You've been walking around trying to find ways to attack Job, haven't you? That's very likely the way it was presented about that. It's possible that he is telling Satan, "I know what you've been up to. I know who you're looking at. You're looking at Job, aren't you? Because he's upright. He fears God and he shuns evil. So is that what you've been looking at? Is that what you've been doing?" And so Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" This is a very important statement that Satan makes. And in fact, in some ways, this actually sums up the entire question of the book. Is Job serving God? Does Job fear God for nothing? In other words, Satan is saying he doesn't fear you for nothing. He doesn't fear you or worship you from his own desire to worship you. He fears and worships you because of the good things that you do for him. So it's almost like you've bought him off, you paid him off. So of course he's going to worship you. Look at all the good stuff you do for him. That's in essence what he says in verse 10. Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. So the only reason that Job's following you is because of what he can get out of you. Now that's a legitimate question that honestly, we all have to ask that question of ourselves. Why is it that we follow God? Have you ever really thought about it? One of the things that this is going to force us to do is think about that kind of question. Because if we think about the gospel of what we call the gospel of health and wealth, and that is the people that say, if you follow God, you get all of your problems taken care of. God will make sure you have all the money that you need. And all your problems will go away. Why is it that they're following God? Is it for the blessing, or is it because they want to follow God, or they know it's the right thing to do? So that really drives at the heart of this. And so Job is tested. Part of the test is not for God to see that, but actually it's for Job to see that. But Satan is a part of this, and Satan makes the accusation, so he allows it to happen. And when he does, he says in verse 11, Satan says, "Now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." So this is the challenge that he throws down to God. Now, we shouldn't look at this as, like I said, as God being petty or God not really knowing. God knows the answer to these questions. He knows what Job's heart is, right? But these kind of questions actually will help Job clarify. And this same question will actually in our hearts will help us clarify what it is that we're doing, why we're doing the things that we do, because that's a very important question. So it's a very fundamental idea that's in this book. And so the Lord said to Satan, "All that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person." So he said, you can take away everything he has, just don't hurt him personally. All right, so he had a protection there. Remember what Satan said. He says, you put a hedge around him, right? A hedge in this case is a positive thing. Remember that. It'll come up again. He said, you have put a hedge around him and all his possessions so that he is protected. The word hedge there is a reference to what they used to do in ancient times. Instead of always having fences, and they did this in Kenya when I was there too. It's fascinating to see. They would actually grow hedges. They would grow bushes around their property. And you could walk through there if you wanted to, but these hedges had thistles and thorns, and you did not want to walk through these. And that's what they would do to protect themselves. So it was basically a natural fence. And that's what Satan said. You're protecting him so much, no harm can come from him. And that's the only reason he's following. So Satan gets the okay to go and do whatever he's going to do. And God allows that to happen. So he does, like I said, he did have restrictions. And it's interesting that God has always put restrictions on Satan. He put restrictions on Satan related to Job. He has restrictions of what he can do to us. God is still in control, and he allows certain things to happen, but there are reasons for it. And a lot of the times those reasons are for our benefit. There's actually almost all the time, it's for our benefit that he allows things to happen. So then Job is attacked by Satan in verses 13 through 19. So let's read through the rest of this, and we may finish out this chapter. It says, now there was a time when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. It was his turn to host them. And a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them when the Sabaeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed all the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels and took them away. Yes, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Wow. You know, talk about a bad day. And these things happen all at the same time, one after the other after the other. This is when the news came to him. They all arrived at the same time, and they're just standing in line, giving him this bad news after bad news. And Satan didn't waste any time. He got right to work, and he caused the worst things, worst afflictions that he could think of, worst harm for his life without taking his own life or harming him. But look at what Job did, Job's reaction. Verse 20 says, Job arose, tore his robes, and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. Now, shaving his head and tearing his robes was a sign of inner torture, really. It was a sign of repentance. It was a sign of deep distress and agony, which you can imagine. He lost everything he owned, and even his children. All of those, everything was lost at one time. And he fell down and he worshiped God. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. That just amazes me, to lose everything like that and have the attitude to sit down and to worship God, to give him praise, and recognize that the only reason he had any of those things to begin with is because God gave them to him. If God gives, he can take. He's going to be fair. This is what he knows. He understands who God is. This is extremely important because it is echoed all throughout. Now, yes, in this book, he does say some pretty hard things. He says some pretty harsh things about God. But at the same time, we have to recognize where he is, what he's going through, and also recognize that he never actually questions God as far as believing that God would do right. He questioned God about his understanding of who God is and what God might do, but he never really questioned God as far as whether or not he would do right. In fact, this is what was one of the most troubling things about him, as we'll see in this book. One of the most troubling things that he went through was the huge dissonance that he felt in his mind between what he was seeing and what he knew about God's nature. And he would not give up on either one. He couldn't deny what he was going through, but he also couldn't deny what God's nature was. And so this conflict actually drove him to questioning God. Please let me, in fact, this is a lot of the book, let me have an audience with you. I don't understand this at all. That was the most agonizing thing to him, was this contradiction in his mind. He wouldn't give up either one. So he says he got a little too big for his britches for a short time. Yeah, at some time he did, in a way. He got a little bit prideful. We'll see that, especially toward the end when God calls him out. He's definitely humbled, but there's a lot of growth that takes place here too. So that's the first chapter. And I want you to notice in all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. And this is going to be kind of a theme all throughout. Again, the reaction is very important. How is it that we react when bad things happen? You know, Carl and I have been in situations, and you probably have too, where we had a lot of news, just bad news at the top of each other. Have you ever been there? I remember looking around at her one time, and we just had so many things pile up all in one day. And we just looked at each other and laughed. You know, it's like, what else is going to happen? You know, it's you never know how you're going to react until you're in a situation. I want to be the kind of person that when all the bad stuff starts piling up, I don't immediately throw God out the window. It draws me closer to God. And that's what we would think would happen. Logically, is what it should happen. But if it always happened that way, that would mean that you could go into hospitals and see people turning to God in the droves, but they don't. There's a reason for that. And that's really because of what they think about God and who they think he is, whether they believe in him or not. So anyway, that's the basic of it. Next week, we'll get into chapter 2, and we'll have a little more discussion. I may have some questions and stuff like that too for us to go through. Anybody have any questions or things that you want to talk about that were brought up in this chapter today? 22. It's not a bad number. If I have a why, then I can endure anyhow. Viktor Frankl. Yeah, that's true. If I know why I'm going through, if I have something, a vision of what I'm trying to get, right? I have an end. That's always a really big one. Is that a comfort to Jesus on the cross?
So that idea was that maybe.
Yeah, that's what Carla said, is that's what Jesus on the cross was thinking about. He wasn't thinking about the cross. He's thinking about the joy that was laid before him, awaiting him after the cross. So good observation. Anyone else? Everybody's muted, but you can unmute yourself if you want to. Okay, well, we'll stop there.